thank you if you became a member or renewed your support during our summer member drive. Your gift allows us to bring you the news from across your state, the country, and around the world. There's still time to make your gift. michiganpublic.org/donate. From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
The clock continues to count down to Tuesday's deadline for a budget deal at the state capitol.
But all parties need to be on board.
By its very nature, it must be negotiated by the House and the Senate and the governor.
Meeting the deadline affects school districts, higher ed, and some local governments, all trying to figure out just how many dollars they will have in their new fiscal years. So here to break down the anticipation and waiting and maybe negotiating that's happening in Lansing are Jordan Hermany and Simon Schuster. They are both Capitol reporters at Bridge, Michigan. Hey, you two.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So let's start with what we do know and what we don't know right now about where things stand. What we know, there is a legal deadline for lawmakers to pass a budget by July 1st. What we don't know, if that's actually going to happen. Simon, where do negotiations stand right now between the Republican-led House and the Democratic-led Senate?
Yeah, well, they're not in a great place at the moment, I think would be sort of the long and short of it. Of course, there's a statutory deadline here, July 1st, that they're hoping to hit because schools have to have their budgets finalized by and submitted to the state by July 7th for review. And we've had issues throughout this legislative session. We have a Republican majority in the House, a Democratic majority in the Senate. They haven't gotten together a whole lot. Generally, the quadrant meetings have been few and far between, whereas in previous divided administrations, we've seen more meetings, more collaboration between these different parts, even though many of them are very far apart on a great number of issues. And not a lot of legislation has come out of this legislature. And so House Speaker Matt Hall has really he doesn't feel that there's an enormous amount of urgency to get this school aid budget done, whereas Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks is sort of trying to say, hey, we have a responsibility to make this happen.
Well, and I think it really goes to underscore the continued relationship that we've seen between Brinks and Hall. I mean, Zoe, you led a panel with them on Mackinac where I believe you asked them to say one nice thing about each other, and even that was a bit of a struggle. So in recent weeks, Hall has said that he and Brinks have been meeting more one-on-one. There is a hope that we could reach some kind of agreement, at least for the schools. But that's coming with a bit of a caveat. What I'm hearing from sources is that the Senate is really hoping to tie some of those talks to passing a general omnibus state government budget. That would involve passing a number of smaller departmental budgets that they say need to come first if we're going to talk about K-12, especially because overarching all of this, we're still convinced that we're going to be able to also negotiate a roads deal utilizing a lot of these same funding pots of money. That seems to be where the holdup is right now. The Senate seems to be wanting to push a number of other budgets through across the finish line before that July 1st deadline. The House seems to just want to focus on K-12. We're going back and forth in terms of who to blame for bringing up the idea of a government shutdown. So we're starting from a ton of very different places right now. And whether or not we will see even just one budget make it to the governor's desk before the end of this month, it really is the question on a lot of lawmakers' minds right now.
Well, Jordan, that is what Democratic Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks told me last Friday. Let's take a listen to that.
Education funding is incredibly important for school districts to know and to know before school starts. There's also interaction between the general fund and the school aid budget. So it's really important for us to talk about both the general fund and the school aid budget together. And if we're going to contemplate a road funding solution, it would be incredibly helpful to talk about the entirety of the state budgets alongside that. And I believe that's really the only way that we will be successful in passing a responsible budget and coming to a solution on road funding.
Jordan, what does it mean to have schools, the general fund, and that road funding package all wrapped up into one?
I mean, to me, and I recognize that I have a gift of what I call a pessimistic optimism, always expecting the worst, but hoping for the best. To me, I mean, that proves to be a very, very hefty lift. We're looking at a legislature who the first bills that they passed were in February, and this was required by state law. We were going to be having, or excuse me, not state law, but a state court case that was going to raise minimum wage. that was the first time that they moved, and it was because there was a literal looming deadline over their heads. And even then, we brought it down very, very close to the wire. So, with respect to this budgetary funding, yes, there is obviously a deadline here. So, we're hoping it does not get as close to the wire there. But and I hate to say it because I am a car owner. I drive on these roads just like everybody else. This roads deal that everyone's talking about, the roads deal that Whitmer has been trying to finagle since getting elected into office, that doesn't necessarily have as immediate of a deadline. I know that they want to connect these two, that we're moving out of the same funding pots, but just realistically looking at what we've been able to get done this year, I mean, the budget's got to come and it's got to come eventually. I am a lot more skeptical that we are going to find some way to also work roads into this. And I have been told by people on background that there are, a couple other days of legislative session scheduled over the summer, and they're not afraid to use them if they do blow past this deadline.
Simon, Jordan was talking about deadlines, and I've been thinking so much about this, that those two bills that Jordan mentioned about minimum wage, about paid sick leave, those were passed because there was a deadline. Then the next two bills had to do with a website that was meant to be available for lawmakers to upload financial information. The website was not working, so bipartisanly, lawmakers came together to extend the deadline. And then finally, a fifth bill having to do with schools and the number of days that kids needed to be in school in northern Michigan after storms, all had deadlines. And here is a very specific deadline, July 1st. What is different about this time as opposed to these other five bills that have been deadline driven but got done?
Yeah, well, I think most prominently is that the legislature wouldn't face immediate consequences or policy changes that are set in stone. Who's being more hung out to dry here is local school districts, intermediate school districts, because what they're trying to do, they have a requirement to get their budgets finalized by the beginning of July. And by sort of having to operate without an idea of where that budget is going, Jordan and I were listening just this morning to the superintendent of Grand Ledge Public Schools, a Lansing area superintendent, who was telling us that right now they have to, in their budgetary process, make guesses that are going to impact students, families, and teachers, and that because they're essentially having to operate on shaky information, they don't know where the budget is going to go. And because the House and the Senate are so far apart on some of their funding allocations, that then these local districts are having to make assumptions where they may have to go back and revise their budgets when we see this actually come through. So the legislature can essentially blow past this deadline without repercussions, but it could create a substantial headache for a lot of these school districts.
Why is it that these local officials, these school district officials, the parents and constituencies that care a lot about having their school budget settled, why don't they have the power to get the legislature to do something here?
I think it's a great question. And I mean, it's important to note, too, that there's a lot of constituencies here. As you say, there's school administrators, school boards, parents of students, there's teachers unions, and they all at times have conflicting priorities. At the same time, because the House and the Senate are so far apart on so many education related funding issues, while they can, pound their fist and yell at the legislature, they also don't want to jeopardize some of these funding priorities, and they want to ensure that they can sort of have these chambers meet in the middle and advance their priorities as best as possible.
Jordan, you've written a lot over the past year about how little is being passed in the legislature. It feels like this budget, right, it is taking up all of the oxygen. And so we know, even this week, right, the House is voting on their own bills, the Senate is voting on their own bills, but it's sort of a stalemate of getting anything else done in the meantime.
Yeah, and I think the most interesting part about that to me is it really depends on who you're talking to as to whether or not that's a good thing.
Right.
I've spoken with some folks who point to that and say, look, where else could you work a job where you show up, you get very little done, and then you turn around and expect, a pretty nice salary, a working salary out of it? Not many places. However, you talk to folks who do favor limited or smaller government, they say, look, we would much rather have 5, 6, 7, 8 bills come out a whole year that have been debated. Republicans and Democrats have found some kind of happy medium middle ground there. And we would rather have that than, say, a billion bills that pass that all align ideologically with one party or another. So, I mean, I guess not to split hairs there, but it really does depend on who you ask as to whether or not this is a good thing. And with the lame duck session. I hate to evoke those scared words already, considering that we're not even into 2026 yet. But the last couple months of a legislative term, that I feel like is where my eyes are right now, insofar as whether or not we can call this fully a productive session or not. But you asked a moment ago, Rick, why folks can't compel lawmakers to try and pass this budget, or try and get on the horse and get motoring. It's because they only have to answer to themselves and their caucus members at the moment. And for what it seems, they could not be further apart in terms of wanting to get specific policy action items done.
So, Simon, we haven't even mentioned Governor Gretchen Whitmer yet. What is her role in all of this?
That's a great question because we have, a pretty deep playbook from Gretchen Whitmer's first term where she had to contend with a legislature that was entirely controlled by Republicans. Both the Senate and the House under them were able to, more or less act in lockstep with one another. They had similar fiscal priorities. And then so essentially they had one negotiating partner in Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office. Now, however, of course, we have a split legislature, a new dynamic that the governor hasn't encountered before. And it makes things much more complicated because it's not just a negotiation between the legislature and the governor's office, but it's a negotiation between the House, the Republican caucus in the House, the Senate, Democratic caucus, and the governor's office as well. And so there's often, I think we saw over the last 2 years when Democrats had trifecta control of state government, often a misaligning of priorities between the executive office of the governor and the legislature, especially legislative Democrats. And so now we sort of have a more complex situation where the negotiations can be significantly trickier.
Do Democrats think that Gretchen Whitmer is showing up for them?
Ooh, that's again a hairy question. I think that not to fall back on what Jordan said before, but this really depends upon who you ask. There's certainly a progressive contingent in this legislature who's deeply frustrated by the governor. First, her overtures to President Trump in order to, as she says, she'll work with anybody to get things done. But then also the fact that she hasn't taken a more visible and forward role in these legislative negotiations, that she's not trying to steer the conversation and the priorities. Of course, her office put out a budget earlier this year that sort of said, here's what I want done. But beyond that, most of what we've seen is behind the scenes. And she and her office seem content to really let the legislature kind of duke it out. And she hasn't really spoken a whole lot about this.
When you look at Whitmer, yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, and to Simon's point, that the folks that are criticizing her about not wanting to show up, she is having to weave a very, very delicate dance here when it comes to not just staying in line with folks in the state and helping guide our budget process here, which obviously has a very immediate effect on us, but as Simon points out, this embracing of President Donald Trump. I mean, we have a lot to lose at the federal level. Just honestly, spin the wheel of fortune and pick a policy item. I'm sure I could find some level of Michigan connection there that she really does have to stay on top of. And she has to make sure that she's not spitting in the face of one side to shake hands with the other. So where Whitmer falls in this, we've seen her take a definite backseat, whether or not that also has anything to do with, and though she's denied it, time and time and time again, ambitions to run for higher office. I'm not saying it hurts her in any way to take a bit more of a step back and lead from behind the scenes. But yeah, when it comes to right now, I think we'll still maybe, and this is just my gut telling me this, have to wait a little while longer before we see Whitmer really come to the front lines on this budgetary stuff. I mean, you think to the 35th Senate District up near Midland that still is without any level of a special election called for months now. Whitmer is entirely capable of doing that, still has not. Again, there's policy implications there, political implications as to why she would not. So this leading behind the scenes thing, we've seen her set this precedent this year. We've seen it since Trump's taken office, and we should probably expect for it to continue, as what my gut is telling me, up and until we really start to hit that hard deadline later this fall of an actual and potential government shutdown should we not pass these budgets.
You're talking about the October 1st deadline that is the beginning of the state's fiscal year, which is not in alignment with these local fiscal years.
And if I could just add, it's not as though the governor has nothing at stake here politically, because the Senate wants to wrap this road funding package into their budget deal, one big, beautiful bill, if you will. And in this instance, the House has passed a road funding plan. And in this, they're essentially gutting key economic development accounts that Governor Whitmer has spent a lot of political capital establishing and used to try to attract these big businesses to and major projects to the state. And so, if I think that I would anticipate that we're going to see her play a larger role in sort of a road funding debate. But as Jordan mentioned earlier, I think it also indicates that it's increasingly unlikely that we may see a road funding deal emerge in a budgetary package.
And this goes back to this idea of what we've been talking about, is that there is the K through 12, the higher ed budgets, whose budgets begin July 1st. There's also the general fund, but there's this road funding deal that's been added into this. And one of the things we know, and that I think Republican Speaker Matt Hall knows, is that Whitmer wants a roads deal. Some of these conversations have to do with her legacy at this point as well.
Absolutely. I mean, she ran on fixing the damn roads. That was her whole slogan. I mean, if you think to a candidate who makes a policy priority pretty much one of their centrally identifiable themes to them as a politician, if you struggle or outright fail to attain that, what kind of message does that send to anyone interested in supporting you politically in the future? Again, I know that Whitmer has said publicly that she is not looking at anything higher right now. I mean, never say never in politics, frankly. Just because she's not looking now does not mean she won't be looking 20 minutes from now, frankly. So yeah, if she struggles or fails or, continues to kick this down the road, it does have pretty poor optics for her, because it signals that while she's very capable of crafting a message, can she get the job done? Can she bring the people needed to the table? 8 years would suggest no if we don't have a roads plan by the end of 26.
Simon, in the final minute or so that we have for folks who are watching the Capitol closely, what should folks be watching for, whether or not you're going to read the tea leaves of whether there can be some kind of deal? Maybe not the huge amorphous all the things, but let's say, school aid fund by Tuesday.
Well, I think what's really important is to look at the House Republicans' budgets that they've already passed. These documents exist as essentially a statement of priorities. There's things where, although it was edited out in the final version, but a draft of the bill would have fined school administrators for using pronouns in emails. And so when you look at sort of this litany of sea change in terms of policy environment, funding priorities, it stakes out an opening negotiating position with a Democratic governor and a Democratic Senate. And what's going to be interesting to see is what pound of flesh Matt Hall is going to be able to extract from whatever final budget passes.
Simon Schuster, Jordan Hermany, they are Capitol reporters at Bridge, Michigan. Very, very smart analysis as we all watch what is happening, going down to the wire with the statutory deadline of July 1 to get the state budget done. Jordan, Simon, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks as always.
And before we are done for the day, a quick reminder that you can sign up for the new It's Just Politics newsletter delivered to your inbox every Friday afternoon with all the latest happenings from the state capitol and Michigan politics. You can sign up at the website michiganpublic.org. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.